Hello, everyone. I am Mark Rosewater, head designer for Magic the Gathering, and welcome to the San Diego Comic-Con Magic the Gathering panel. We again are at my house because the pandemic not quite over yet, but we both have been vaccinated, so we're being safe here. But anyway, I'm here with Jules Robins, who is the lead designer of Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realm, and we're going to talk all about it today.
Oh, I am so excited to finally be able to talk about this set.
Okay, so let's start from the very beginning. Magic and D&D were linked, I would say, from Alpha, from the very beginning. If you look at stuff like Lich, or Fireball, or Northern Paladin.
Clone.
I mean, Richard Garfield clearly was a fan of Dungeons & Dragons. He played in his youth. And you could see from Magic, at the very, very early parts of Magic, that Dungeons & Dragons had an influence on Magic. So D&D and Magic were linked from the very beginning. So in 1998, Wizards of the Coast purchased TSR, who previously had made Dungeons & Dragons, and became part of the Wizards family. And one of the big worries at the time when we bought the company was that both of our big properties were fantasy properties, and we were a little bit worried that they might get confused for one another. And so in the early days, we had a saying, which is, don't cross the streams. The idea was, let Magic be Magic, let Dungeons & Dragons be Dungeons & Dragons, and we really, for many years, kept them apart. And you'll notice over time, every once in a while, we'd make a card, like we made Bag of Holding. In Unstable, we made sort of Dungeons & Dragons that was a little nod to Dungeons & Dragons. So we had done little tiny nods toward it. And then what I think happened was we hired James Wyatt, who used to work on Dungeons & Dragons on the Magic Creative team. And he was working on, I think it was an art book for Battle for Zendikar.
Right, and writing all this description of the world and the people in it and all the settings, and went, oh, this is a lot like what I used to do on D&D books.
Yeah, so he started making what's called Plane Shift, which was sort of, they were magic worlds written so you could use them in Dungeons & Dragons. And he made Zendikar, and then he made Innistrad, and he made Kaladesh, and Amonkhet, and Dominaria.
And maybe Strixhaven's coming up.
And so what happened was, not only did he start making Plane Shift, even Dungeons & Dragons, they made both a Ravnica and the Theros guidebook. So Dungeons & Dragons started making Magic content. So anyway, flash forward a little bit, Aaron Forsyth has this idea, what we now know as Universes Beyond. And the idea of Universes Beyond is, what if other IPs appeared on Magic cards? And once that conversation got going, one of the things that came up really quickly was, well, why not Dungeons & Dragons? The audience has been asking forever for Dungeons & Dragons. Why don't we do that? And really everybody's like, yeah, we should. So this story really is the story of how Dungeons & Dragons, the set, Adventures in the Forgotten Realm, came to be. And it started really simply with, let's make a Dungeons & Dragons set. Okay, so do you remember the very first incarnation of how D&D was, how Magic D&D set was going to be?
Yeah, well, at the very start, we were like, all right, we've got core set 2021 the year before, and then this will be core set 2022. It's like, instead of a different mechanic returning or whatever, it'll be set Dungeons & Dragons setting. Right,
so that was the very first version of the set was, okay, we'll just do a core set, and just the twist on the core set will be, oh, it's flavored like Dungeons & Dragons. Okay, but that didn't happen. What happened? Why didn't we make that?
Right, so we started in on that and made a bunch of simple Magic cards capturing elements of D&D things, and it just felt too much like just a normal Magic set, and didn't reward people who were longtime D&D fans, had been waiting for Magic to go and cross the streams with D&D for decades, and wasn't paying it off enough.
Right, well, it was a little too tame, right?
Right.
We're finally going to do a D&D set. Why not let's do a D&D set? So what happened was, we first went to the D&D team, and they were excited for us to do it. I did one request. So what was the one request?
Put it in the Forgotten Realms. D&D's huge. It's been around for decades. We can't cram it all into this one set.
Yeah, and the Forgotten Realms is super popular. So we're like, okay, we can make the Forgotten Realms. That seemed easy. Okay, so the next big thing was trying to figure out sort of how much D&D was supposed to go into the D&D set. So we have something cool for you. We did some testing. So we actually have something that's never been seen before. We're going to show right here. So what we did is we made a bunch of cards, and it was a spectrum of cards. On one end was like things we'd clearly do, and the other end were things we don't think we do. And so we made a whole bunch of different magic cards, mocked them up, and we actually had people in, and we showed it to them, and we tested. And we said, okay, how does this feel to you? And I know we brought in Magic players, and we brought in D&D players, and we brought in both Magic and D&D players that were both.
Yeah, we even brought in people who didn't play either game, but were kind of interested in both of them.
Right, so we did a whole bunch of testing. So what you're seeing right now has never been seen outside of the testing room, has never been seen. So there were, I think, 7 categories of Magic cards. So here's the first, okay, the example of the first category was Magic Missile.
Right, so start off with the baseline, the sort of stuff we're pretty sure we're going to do somewhere. It's like, here's just exactly the text of a Magic card. Here you've got Arc Lightning that meshes well with a concept in D&D, with the D&D flavor on it.
Right, so the first category was actual Magic cards, just reskinned in flavor. Clearly we'll do them, we've done them before. Okay, so the second category was a Constitution check.
Right, so here we're going, this isn't a pre-existing Magic card, it's new mechanics, it's trying to evoke something in D&D here, how a skill check works, where you're adding and trying to get over a target number, but it's just using baseline Magic mechanics.
Right, so it's top-down flavor, but right, it's doing things Magic does, just more top-down flavor. Okay, third category was Tomb of Annihilation category. So what was this?
Right, so we're getting further from what we would just put into a Magic set. It's like, this dungeon is basically a saga, but it runs for a lot longer than we'd normally make a saga run, because Magic game usually doesn't have time for that. But it's really selling this thing from D&D as hard as we can through baseline Magic mechanics.
Right, so okay, so this category is, we're starting to stretch Magic mechanics. We're still using the core Magic mechanics, but we're stretching them to do things that Magic mechanics normally don't do. Okay, category number 4, Holy Symbol.
Okay, so here's where we're saying, okay, it's not Magic as usual. Something is working like it doesn't in Magic, trying to capture D&D. My creatures are casting spells? I don't know what that means, but it's what the clerics and the paladins in D&D do, so we'll figure it out.
Okay, 5th category, Enlarged Creature is our example. What was this 5th category?
Right, so we went, dice rolling is the loud, well-known central mechanic of D&D. How would people feel about that in their black-bordered Magic?
Okay, the 6th category, no locations example here. So what is this category?
Right, so this is going a step further. It's like not just taking a mechanical element from D&D, but really trying to replicate the mechanics of D&D, where it's like, how do you make a skill check in D&D? You roll a die, you add a number to it that's representative of how good you are at that thing, and you're trying to get over a target threshold for the result.
Okay, and the final category number 7, was a Boss Dragons, for example.
So this final one, again, the furthest on we don't think we want to do this, is like, what if you're really just kind of playing D&D with your Magic cards somehow? Can we make you bring a big book and flip through it at the game table? Probably not, but like, what is grabbing people from D&D? Do they want to go all the way here?
Okay, and the real point of this testing was, it was a full spectrum, right? It's from a Magic card that you already know, just reskinned, all the way to, you need to use Dungeons & Dragons, literally the book, to play the game. And so what happened? What was the testing? What did it show us?
Well, it varied somewhat depending on which category of people we were asking. Certainly, the more deeply into Magic people were, the more scared off they were by things that just didn't make any sense to them in the Magic rules, like flipping through a book. But there were some through lines and, splits to try to solve all of these audiences. Some big takeaways were really much more so than the literal mechanics of D&D, what we needed to capture was the ethos of D&D. Like, reading and playing with these cards needed to feel like the emotions that you have surrounding Dungeons and Dragons. And the cards need to, resonantly speak to that. It's like, if I'm seeing a card representing a monster or a spell, I need to get the same feel that that thing has in Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay, so the big takeaway was capturing the flavor was more important than anything. That it's okay if it played like Magic, but it really had to be evocative. It had to feel like Dungeons and Dragons. It could play like Magic, but it had to feel like D&D. Okay, so let's talk about the actual making of the set. Okay, so let's start with the dungeons. So Magic has dragons, but Magic doesn't normally have dungeons. So how did the dungeons come to be?
Right, so this was on our minds from the start. I mean, you saw the Tomb of Annihilation in the testing images, but we're like, a big central piece of D&D is this exploration and journeying into the unknown and contending with the challenges there. And so we wanted you to be able to go on an adventure. And again, trying to bridge the whole spectrum of people who are longtime D&D players to people who only know of it. It's like, clearly the place to try to do this is in a dungeon. It's right there in the name, right? So the very first thing we started was going back to a mechanic we'd previously tried, actually, that had best captured this to try to figure out what parts made it tick. The original incarnation of sagas as they were first submitted. Okay,
well, that's something I actually worked on. So in original Dominaria, the really early versions of the sagas looked kind of like a game board. And it would have a path that just kind of went across the card. And then we had icons on some of the squares. So like you would be moving things along, and every once in a while, when you hit a certain square, the effect would go off. Now we ended up consolidating that. It's a little complex, but there's something very fun about this go on a journey sort of quality that the finished sagas had some of that, but wasn't quite as novel, I guess, as the early version.
Okay. And so we picked out a few things from this that we were sure we really wanted to replicate. There was this moment of looking ahead and, making a choice about where you're going to go that felt very much like in D&D, anytime you come to a split in the path, and this looking ahead to something cool down the line. And so we took that and went in a completely different direction to try to capture it with a whole second deck.
A second deck.
So the next iteration of Dungeons we tried had a dungeon deck where you'd have a bunch of cards, each representing a different room, and you'd shuffle it, and something in the main Magic game would put you into the first card of this deck. And you'd put your marker in a room, and there would be doorways opening off of it, and you'd have to flip more cards for what was through the door, and every so often you'd be able to move your marker and explore a new room and try to figure out where you were going in this dungeon as it spawned.
Okay, so why didn't that work out?
Well, there were a bunch of different challenges. A big one was just, it's really hard to play test. There are so many combinations of ways these rooms could slot together and what order they might come up with in the game versus the other cards on the board. And this is a set going into standard and going to be drafted competitively. We need to be able to do good balance work on it. But regardless of figuring all that out, there was just no way to even balance it with infinite time and resources, because the problem wasn't just in power level, but in the disparity between what might happen. Are you going to see a room ahead that's really good in the current situation, or one that's really bad? And too much variance for competitively minded players to be unable to plan what's going to happen around this.
So as a person who did this with contraptions in Unstable, one of the things about a second deck is when we talk about variance means how different things are going to be. And so if you play the same game multiple times, how different can they happen? And high variance is a lot of fun, just because different things happen all the time. And in casual play, we like high variance. When I make an unset, I'll lean into high variance because I want things to be very different from game to game. But in a competitive setting where there's a tournament and there you want some sense of consistency, right? We want the better player to win. So variance, while it's very fun, causes problems in competitive play, and so we have to be careful how high a variance we make in standard legal sets. And so, right, it was a little too high variance. It was fun. I mean, it's cool. I'm a huge fan of second decks, but it definitely didn't quite. It wasn't something that the play design team. Whenever we make something, we go to the play design team and we have them gauge on a scale. Is this easy to do or really hard to do? And this was really hard to do. So I'm sure the play designer said, "Can we try other things? Maybe not this."
Right, and it had all sorts of secondary issues where it's contraption deck, great, you bring it if you're playing with contraptions, but as soon as you put competition on the line, it's all right, I'm not playing with any dungeon cards, but I've got to bring a dungeon deck so my opponent thinks I might be playing with dungeon cards.
Yeah.
And a bunch of similar rabbit holes there.
Okay, so so second deck didn't work. What was the next step?
Right, so after the second deck, we got to something a lot closer to the dungeons as you saw them. We went, okay, what if there's one game piece and it'll have a set layout of rooms, but it's sort of a mini game unto itself. Mm-hmm. Every room will have not just a reward for finishing the room, but a condition for how you get through it. Mm-hmm. So this room I might need to attack with 3 creatures to get through, and that room I might have to draw 2 cards in the same turn to get through, and so you'll try to find a path you can complete through this dungeon. Okay, so there was both, you had to do something to get in the room, and then there's a reward for getting in the room, or getting through the room? Yeah, getting through the room. Okay, so what happened there? Well, there was clearly, still the seed of something cool here, but this was just mind-melting to try to play with. I mean, I'm not even sure all the words could have fit onto a single magic card, but trying to think ahead 3 rooms for whether you would be able to fulfill its condition to get through it and plot your path through the dungeon was an impossible task. Okay, this is too much. So too much cognitive load is what we say in R&D. Exactly. So we went, okay, how can we scale this down? What if instead of the rooms having their own challenges, we integrate this back more into the Magic game? Your Magic cards are the ones taking you through the dungeon. The dungeon's just telling you what you get out of traversing it. Mm-hmm. And we got very close to the dungeons as you see them. Well, without the S. We had the dungeon, and we started working on that. So how did it go from 1 dungeon to 3 dungeons? Right, so now we found ourselves in the opposite problem from the deck, where we had too little game-to-game variance. A Magic card's just not that big. We couldn't fit this huge sprawling dungeon with a ton of choices onto it. So, we picked and chosen the very most fun rooms out of there, but it was going to get boring over the course of, some people drafting this set 50 or 100 times. And Aaron Forsyth had the suggestion, if we can't fit all this on one card, what if we just had multiple dungeons and you got to pick which one to go into? Okay, and then how'd you get number 3? Well, once we knew we didn't want 1, 2 just didn't feel like enough of a choice. It was I have this whole extra complex analysis step of where am I going, but ultimately it's probably going to be scripted for me. One of these is just going to be the better thing to do here than the other. And so we wanted at least 3 to really give a sense of, agency in what was going on here. But as soon as we started playing with 3, we realized 4 was right out the window. Looking ahead through these dungeons is pretty difficult, and the mechanic needs to be accessible to everyone. And also, you didn't want to repeat effects too much, and there's only so many effects you can do. So 3 was you could pull off 3, but you couldn't do more than 3. Right. Okay, so that was dungeons. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Class enchantments. How did class enchantments come to be? So these really spawned from the one thing we looked at even before how to capture a sense of you adventuring was in Dungeons and Dragons, you play as a character. And so we wanted to figure out what that meant. And the first place we looked here were also much further back, the old Vanguard cards.
Okay, for those that don't know what Vanguard cards, this also goes back to 1998. So we made these, they were larger than normal Magic cards, and we made it for, I think it's called Arena back then, but like in-store play. And the way the cards worked is they had a character on them. Interestingly, they were the Weatherlight characters, because that's the story we were talking at the time. And then it changed your starting hand size, and it changed your starting life total, and it granted you ability. And depending on the ability, maybe your hand or life size goes up or down, but you could then build your deck around this flavor. And so we made those for a while. I think if you go on to Gather, you probably can see them. But they're definitely a lot of fun.
Right. And Magic Online kept using this space for a long time, even after the physical ones. It does a really good job of giving your gameplay sort of a consistent character-based pattern. But they got to give you extra strength on top of your normal Magic deck because it's its own self-contained format. You're playing against other Vanguards. We immediately ran into the problem trying to have you play as a character in baseline Magic. Where it's like, how are we going to have some people play with characters, but not everyone? Mm-hmm. How can we restrict this so that, only certain decks will play with characters? Can we require certain cards that you're going to have to use or certain ways you have to play the game? And ultimately decided, there wasn't a good way to do this that was going to get us far enough away from companions to be their own separate thing, releasing soon after. Okay,
so, and, originally you guys, it was the creatures, right, that had the upgrades originally?
Right, so the next place we looked here was, what about leveling up? We did the level up mechanic in Rise of the Eldrazi, where you can pay mana to make your creatures better over time. And so we looked at reprising that, and then when we were exploring the character cards, we were like, okay, maybe this will do nothing initially, but you'll have to level it up to get access to the abilities. And even though we scrapped the character cards, we really liked that idea, where not your creatures, but you are leveling up. Sure. And what if we could just put that into your deck? You'll have to take on the class after the game begins. And so that's how we got basically to the class enchantments as we see them, just moving from level ups, sort of mana per level and level gates, to easier chunking, where we just tell you how much mana it's going to cost to get to your next ability.
That's cool. Okay, let's move on to dice rolling. Because a little history of dice rolling, because Magic has had dice rolling. So back in 1998, a lot of the story goes back to 1998. I made a set called Unglued, which was a silver bordered set that was not tournament legal. And I was just trying to do wacky, crazy things. And dice rolling seemed like, a lot of gamers have a six-sided die, and it felt like a fun thing to do. So the interesting thing is we made them, and then when we got our market research back, some of the die rolling cards were loved, and some were hated. And originally when the second unset on Hinge, I didn't have die rolling because they're like, players said they didn't like some of them. But when I did, I actually looked into the research, because on Stable I brought them back. What I found was there are die rollings that players like and die rolling that players don't like. What they do like is, for example, there was a card in Unglued called Elvish Impersonator. And you roll 2 dice, and one was the power and one was the toughness. And you always got a creature, but maybe it's a 1/1, maybe it's a 6/6. Yeah, who knows? It could be all sorts of things. There's 36 options of what it could be. But other cards, there were cards, for example, where you would roll a die and you had no idea what the effect would be until you rolled the die. And players were like, well, how do I even put this in my deck? I don't know what's going to happen. We had a tutor where you didn't know what you were tutoring for. And we're like, well, I'm not going to play a tutor unless I know what I'm going to get. And so the cards that were random in a way where the dice just didn't let you plan around it or didn't give you expectation weren't really liked at all. But the ones in which you had some idea what you were doing were very popular and very fun. Okay, so we're doing dice in silver border. How did it get into black border? How did this happen?
Right, so we start with, again, trying to capture things people love out of D&D. There's this amazing moment of tension where you're going and trying to do something very important, and then you roll the d20 and see if it's going to work out. And we were like, how can we capture this? Are we flipping cards off the top of the deck? Are we revealing cards from the hand? We should really just use the same solution D&D did. It's going to feel a lot more like Dungeons & Dragons if you're just rolling a die. But even so, we started looking at D6s. Like 20 different sides is, again, a lot of variance. How are we going to make a magic card reflect this? And the breakthrough on that front was thinking about skill checks like D&D has, where you're trying to hit some target and maybe you'll succeed or maybe you'll fail, but it's not every result is its own gradation on the scale.
Right. There's it's not like on a 20-sided die there's 20 different outcomes. There's some number, there's 2 or 3 outcomes, but it's a much limited, and you have some sense of gauging it.
Right. And so that was the first spot we got onto these cards, and so we designed some spells that had an effect and then rolled and maybe got an additional effect, and some creatures that played and then maybe did something when they entered the battlefield if you roll a die, and people hated them.
Yeah, one of the things that I should point out is when we were playing this in the playtesting and stuff, die rolling was very polarizing. Some of the people loved it, and some of the people hated it. And so there was a lot of conversation. There were definitely people who were like, remove this from the set, this shouldn't be there. And there were equally people very passionate that are like, no, this is fun, You should like die rolling is fun, let people die roll. It's a really iconic part of Dungeons & Dragons, and look, it's fun.
And so with all this conflicting feedback, we decided to really dig into exactly what was setting everyone off in each of these camps. Just go through everyone and be like, all right, don't just tell me you hated the die rolling. Which cards did you hate? What happened in your games? And the more we dug into it, the more we found most of the people who loved the die rolling loved having this moment of tension, waiting, finding out what was going to happen, seeing how good a thing they would get. But most of the people who hated the die rolling hated either getting nothing when the result came up poorly, or the whole game hinging on what was coming out of this die roll.
Yeah, one of the things that is just a game design thing in general is one of the things you always, whenever someone is unhappy, you want to figure out why they're unhappy. And a big part we've learned about randomization is players don't like randomization determining the outcome of the game. Like, it's just it's like, I roll a die, and if I roll good, I win the game. If I roll bad, I lose the game. That's not a good experience, because you want to feel like you won the game, right? You, the player, want to win the game. You want to feel like the dice wins the game for you. So the key there is trying to figure out where to put the randomization, where there's moments of fun tension that everything doesn't hinge on it, but cool things can happen.
Right. And so one big aspect of this was the one Mark touched on earlier, where the cards need to be predictable, right? We've got Farada's Fireball. The burn spell's not dealing 3 damage to a creature or 4 damage to a creature, and you try to hit a 4 toughness creature and don't know whether it's going to work out. You can understand basically the sort of thing the card's going to accomplish when you cast it, and then see how well it works out above and beyond that. And the effects also aren't giving your whole team +2/+2 or +4/+4 and maybe ending the game on the spot. They're trying to set you up in different positions for later turns to then matter, and later decisions. So more like the starting hand. Here's a random element, and now you have to figure out what to do as a result.
Okay, so one of my favorite parts with the die rolling is the way they got laid out. As someone who's played D&D, the chart, the die rolling chart is really cool. So how'd you get to the chart? How did that happen?
Yeah, so right, like I was saying, we had these skill checks. Essentially, you were succeeding or failing, and people hated getting nothing. But we got that feedback even on cards where you weren't getting nothing. We had a card that would make 3 goblins, and then you rolled a d20 to see whether you got a 4th. But it felt like getting nothing because the 3 was already baked in early. And we wanted to sort of recalibrate this, set it as like, no, here's what the die roll's giving you. Not a bonus on top of the card, but I'm rolling to see how many goblins I'm going to make. And the best way to lay that out was right there in the D&D books. We looked through, looked at some roll tables, and went, it's perfect.
Okay, so we got dungeons, we got classes, we got die rolling.
Where are the dragons?
Where are they? What are the dragons? Let's talk about the dragons. So here's one of the things that was really interesting. We can illustrate this with one of the cycles of dragons. So in D&D, there is a white dragon, a blue dragon, a black dragon, a red dragon, and a green dragon. Like
exactly the colors of magic. Well, it can't not do them, right?
Okay, so this is a good story of, okay, so clearly, how do you not do the 5 dragons colored like the colors of magic? Like, you can't not do that. But what was the problem?
So, got the chromatic dragons. They're all laid out nicely, only their powers and personalities aren't exactly one-to-one with the magic color pie. I mean, how would they be? So, suddenly we've got a blue dragon that needs to breathe lightning, and a white dragon that needs to breathe frost, and a green dragon with poisonous fog. And how do we represent those in ways that make sense in their colors in Magic and still are true to the creature in D&D?
And this, by the way, is one of the challenges of doing, like, when we make a Magic set, we sort of control the flavor, if you will. Like, if something doesn't feel red enough, we can change it and make it feel more red. But in this set, we're doing Dungeons & Dragons, right? We're capturing, like, the thing we're capturing exists. And so one of the challenges is, like, sometimes fitting in the color pie has issues. Like, okay, lightning is not what a blue card would be doing, but how does a blue dragon not have lightning? That's iconic to the blue dragon. And I know your team worked really hard in, like, trying to find how do we make that happen?
Right. So it's like different solutions for different problems. Magic has done a lot of ice, and almost always as tapping a creature and keeping it from untapping. And while that's not exactly what white normally does, it's usually a blue effect. It's very close. White does a lot of tapping. White does a lot of other disabling of creatures. It's somewhere we occasionally bend, and did for that card. Whereas Magic normally does lightning through direct damage, which is just nowhere near blue's slice of the color pie. So we had to sit down and go, like, what else might lightning mean? And the thing we got to was, like, this moment of, like, shock and paralysis, and ended up marrying it with power reduction in the blue space.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that's really interesting as we look through the set is how much, like, the thing that I really appreciate as somebody who, has played D&D and obviously plays Magic, is all the recognition of how you guys manage to do things, how you manage to capture something. There's just so many really cool cards, which is like, oh wow, I don't know if we've ever make this Magic card without this flavor, but wow, it makes a really fun Magic card. And that was really cool.
Right, that's more where the green dragon ended up, where it's like, all right, well, green does a lot of poisoning, but via, like, Death Touch, which is this creature directly doing something, not an enters the battlefield effect like the rest of these breath weapons are. Can we sort of turn that on its head and make your opponent's creatures poisoned instead of your creatures poisonous?
Yeah. Another flavor thing that I thought was really cool was, we're talking about creature types for a second. So Magic has a lot of creature types. But one of the things about going into, like, a world that's somebody else's world is there's a lot of very iconic things there. And, you know, like, for example, the race class model we use in Magic originally came from D&D, right? D&D has races, has classes. And so there were races like halflings and tieflings that we wanted to do. There were classes like Bard and Ranger. And there was monsters like Beholder and a Gnoll. So how did you figure out what was new and what was not?
Yeah, so pretty early on, James White and I sat down to just go through everything we thought we were likely to want to represent in the set and try to figure out, is this an existing Magic creature type or does it need a new one? And a lot of this was, going off of feel. The Sorcerer, even though it's not a Magic type and we've got, like, cards named Sorcerer with Wizard in their type, we realized we weren't really using Shaman anywhere, and it was really hitting this same, like, innate natural magic sense. Versus, Magic's got Kithkin, which are kind of like halflings, but it just feels too weird to have Kithkin on the type line of your halfling cards. They need their own creature type. And Beholders, they're not really an eye. They've got a bunch of them all over.
Yeah. No, I mean, for example, it's interesting, like, Owlbear is like a bird bear, right? So it's neat. Where can we use existing creature types? Where do we need to use new ones? And it's funny, like what you can tell. I mean, a lot of the people who make Magic are also people who have enjoyed Dungeons and Dragons. So like we too, just like Richard was influenced back in Alpha, we too are influenced by it. So one of the things that always goes on in Magic is you definitely see, like we've talked about doing the Ranger type before. I mean, Beholder at least had to be Beholder, so we never made. But it is interesting looking at seeing where we can do things and where we can't. And so that was like one of the fun things for me of looking at the set is seeing the mix of the D&D flavor and sort of the Magic mechanics and how you guys put them all together. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was a complex puzzle, but got a lot of people very invested in getting it right.
So anyway, we are out of time here, but I want to thank Jules for being with us. So any last thoughts, Jules, about Dungeons & Dragons?
I guess the one thing I really want to stress is we worked really hard to make sure this set was open to everyone. It's got a bunch of really, really strong D&D flavor, and if you've played a lot of D&D, you'll see it and you'll recognize things and you'll love it. But we worked very hard to set it up so that if you play Magic and not D&D, the cards make sense and the concepts are resonant and can come through, and the cards are going to just feel like good evocative Magic cards to you. And on the other end, if you played a bunch of D&D and not Magic, hopefully this is like capturing a lot of the things that you love in D&D and giving a lot of the same emotional payoffs and a nice entryway into getting the game experience that you love in the system of Magic.
Yeah, I have to say, as someone who, I mean, I've had a chance to play with it, obviously. The thing that really struck me is that you guys did such a good job of, right, if you're a D&D fan, it is dripping with D&D. Just left and right, and the legendary characters and the flavor it's just dripping with D&D. But if you're not a D&D player, if you're just a Magic player, if I just told you we went to a brand new plane called the Forgotten Realms, it's a brand new Magic plane, like, you wouldn't know any different. It really does feel, I mean, I think D&D is kind of in Magic's bones, but it feels like we went to a new world. And okay, maybe you've never seen a Beholder before, but okay, we make new creatures. I mean, so if you're a Magic player that hasn't played D&D, it feels very much like a Magic set. I mean, it introduces you to the world of D&D, and D&D is a really amazing world. It's been around forever, and there's lots of cool stuff. So, like, it's really neat that if you're a D&D player, you get a chance to learn Magic. If you're a Magic player, you get a chance to learn D&D. And if you're both, you should already love the set. So,
thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you very much. So, guys, thank you very much for being here for the Magic the Gathering panel. I've been with Jules Robins. I'm Mark Rosewater. Thank you so much for joining us. And the set comes out this week. So, if this sounds exciting, if you'd like to play some Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, go to your local game store and get some. So anyway, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you all next year. Hopefully not in my living room. Bye-bye.